In the NFL's billion-dollar concussion settlement, two retired players could take the exact same test, get the exact same score, and still end up with completely different results. One may qualify for hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation, and the other might not get anything. Why is this, you ask? Well, if it isn't the injury, and if it isn't the test, what could it possibly be? Race. The answer is race. Pay attention. For years, the settlement used a practice called race norming, a method that adjusted brain injury evaluations based on whether a player was classified as black or white. Critics said the system quietly assumed black players started with lower cognitive ability. That meant they had to prove more brain damage to qualify for help. And this wasn't some tiny issue buried in legal paperwork. It affected a settlement worth billions of dollars and thousands of former players whose health had already been damaged by football. But the story doesn't stop with the NFL, because the thinking behind race norming has a long history inside of medicine itself. A history where race is built into diagnoses, treatments, decisions about who gets care. And once you see that larger pattern, the NFL controversy starts to look less like an isolated incident and more like the latest version of something much older. But to see how we got there, you have to start with the settlement itself. And that is where the real story begins.
This morning, the NFL is praising a settlement over the concussion lawsuits. It was filed by more than 5,000 former players.
The NFL concussion settlement came after years of lawsuits from former players dealing with serious brain conditions, memory loss, depression, early dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and many believed repeated head trauma during their careers caused permanent damage. In 2013, the league reached a settlement with thousands of retired players. The program eventually became an uncapped compensation fund. To decide who qualified for compensation, the program relied on neuropsychological testing. These tests measure things like memory, attention, language, and processing speed. Players take the tests, and their scores are compared against an estimated baseline to decide whether their cognitive decline is severe enough to qualify as dementia or another impairment. Simple, right? But this is where things start to get wicked. Shout out to Zevi. I'm about to get real technical here, but I'm gonna provide visual aids. I got you. The baseline estimate became one of the most important parts of the entire process, because the settlement allowed doctors to calculate what a player's pre-morbid intellectual ability was. Basically, the system tried to estimate how smart the player would have been before the brain damage, and one of the variables allowed in that calculation was race. Mind you, some tests use different reference data sets depending on whether the player was classified as black or white, so the same raw score can be interpreted differently based on a racial category attached to the player. On paper, the reasoning came from older neuropsychological research, put a pin in that, we'll get back to it, that allegedly tried to account for unequal education and social conditions that could affect test scores. But inside a compensation system, that logic carried very different consequences, because now those adjustments could decide whether a player received money in medical care or walked away with nothing. And eventually, two former players decided to challenge that system in court. And that is when things blew wide open.
You think it's because he's black?
I absolutely think it because he's black. I think he's been discriminated against.
In August of 2020, two retired NFL players filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. Those players' names were Kevin Hendry and Najeh Davenport. Both have gone through the settlement's testing process. Both believe the system had treated them unfairly. Their complaint argued that race norming wasn't just some technical detail. They said it acted like a racial barrier inside the compensation system. The lawsuit decided cases where players with identical test results could receive different impairment classifications depending on whether race-adjusted norms were used. In one example, from the complaint, an evaluation that supported impairment was later reinterpreted using a demographic model that included race, age, and education. After that adjustment, poof, the impairment classification suddenly disappeared, and the case was denied. Davenport's case followed a similar pattern. According to the lawsuit, a doctor initially found that he qualified for compensation, but during the appeals process, the league argued that race-based adjustments should have been used. They literally argued for the right to be racist. Once those adjustments were applied, the threshold for impairment was no longer met. No qualification, no payout. The players argued that race norming effectively forced black retirees to prove greater cognitive decline than white players. Naturally, the national media took notice, and then in March of 2021, a federal judge dismissed the lawsuit on procedural grounds, saying it was not the proper way to challenge the settlement structure. So that's the end, right? Nope. What the judge did do was make one thing clear. The concerns about race norming were serious enough that the court ordered the league and the settlement lawyers to address the issue directly. And that's when the system started to change.
Investigation into a lawsuit claiming the NFL uses race as a factor in determining which former players are compensated for head injuries.
By mid-2021, pressure around the settlement had reached another level. Investigative reporting had pushed the issue into public view. This is why journalism matters. Advocates demanded answers. Former players wanted their claims reviewed, and eventually the NFL had to announce a major change. The league agreed to eliminate race norming going forward and reviewed past claims for potential bias. A new rule was put in place inside the settlement. No race-based norms, no demographic models using race, a shift towards race-neutral testing standards, proving again that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. But the obvious question came right after that. What about the claims that have already been denied? Great question, imaginary audience member watching this while pooping, eating, and/or both. To deal with that, the settlement created a rescoring and retesting process for affected players. Under the revised rules, players whose tests have been interpreted using race adjustments could have those scores reevaluated under the new standard. Then in 2022, early results from that rescoring process started to come out. A group of 646 black former players had their test results reviewed. And the outcome was telling, but not really surprising. That gave them access to more medical treatment and testing. Those numbers represented only part of the claims that are being reevaluated. Still, they showed they were hard to be ignored. For hundreds of players, race-adjusted scoring had changed eligibility for money and care. And even after all those changes, one major problem remained. The full scale of the disparity still is not unknown because the settlement has never consistently released full data for the payouts and the now data broken down by race. And that leaves one even bigger unanswered question. How many players were actually affected? To answer that, you have to zoom out. Because the NFL didn't invent this kind of thinking. They aren't that creative. Medicine had been doing versions of this for a long time. Let's take a closer look.
Exclusion, discrimination, and the historic trauma that follows have created barriers to black participation in these systems.
The idea of adjusting medical measurements based on race has a long history that has roots in slavery, like most things in America, but that's a different video. For decades, all kinds of diagnosis tools use race as a built-in variable. Kidney disease formulas once included race adjustments when estimated kidney function. Lung capacity tests used different reference values for different racial groups. And in neuropsychology, demographic corrections sometimes included race along with age and education. Researchers argue that different groups might show different average test results because of unequal education to education, healthcare, or opportunity. So they adjusted the reference standards to avoid overdiagnosing impairment. But the critics say that logic creates a dangerous shortcut. Instead of measuring the actual reasons behind those differences, the system uses race as a stand-in. And once race gets built into the formula, it can quietly shape who qualifies for treatment, resources, or even legal compensation. Essentially, in a roundabout way, they were using the effects of racism as justification for being racist. Attempts have been made toward progress though, a little. Kidney medicine moved from race-adjusted equations to race-neutral formulas. Respiratory medicine had pushed to stop using race-based lung capacity interpretations, and more medical groups now describe race as a social category and not a biological baseline. That matters, because when race gets treated like a built-in biological fact, historical inequity can get baked right into modern healthcare. But the roots of that go back much further, back to some of the ugliest chapters in American medical history. And that's where the story gets even heavier.
And it's entwined with the regrettable history of people of color being exploited by American doctors and medical organizations.
The relationship between race and medicine in the United States has often been shaped by exploitation. One of the clearest examples is in the Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972. Hundreds of black men with syphilis were observed by government researchers who withheld treatment on purpose, even after penicillin became widely available. The study continued for 40 years without informed consent, leading to at least 128 people dying from complications. Another example comes from the 19th century. Surgeon J. Marion Sims developed surgical techniques through experimentation operations on enslaved black women who had no power to refuse. That's why they tore that racist bastard statue down in 2018. Good job, New York. Then there's Henrietta Lacks. During cancer treatment in the 1950s, doctors took her cells without her permission. Those cells became the famous HeLa cell line, which was used in decades for biological research. Her family didn't even find out about this until years later. And then, who can forget the eugenics era? In the early 20th century, medical authorities helped justify forced sterilization programs across the United States. More than 60,000 people were sterilized under those policies, many of them poor, vulnerable, or part of marginalized communities like, you guessed it, being African American. Each of those cases point to the same pattern. Medical institutions treating racial categories as tools for control, experimentation, or exclusion. So when the NFL's concussion settlement used race inside of a diagnostic formula, critics saw it as part of that same tradition. Not identical to those earlier abuses, but connected to the same basic assumption that race can be used as a shortcut for determining health outcomes. And once that assumption enters the system, the damage can't stay inside medicine. It spreads into law, money, and access. Which brings us to the real takeaway here.
What did we learn, Palmer?
The NFL's concussion settlement was supposed to address the damage that football caused to thousands of players. Instead, it exposed another problem hidden inside the system that was supposed to help them. Race norming changed how brain injuries were measured. It influenced who qualified for compensation, and it forced the league to rewrite part of their own settlement. The rescoring process has already allowed hundreds of players to receive benefits they wouldn't have qualified for before. But the full impact may never be known without transparent data on payouts and denials. And that leaves us with a much bigger question. If race adjustments could shape something this important in a brain injury settlement, where else are they still shaping outcomes inside healthcare? Across medicine, institutions are now rethinking race-based algorithms and pulling them out of diagnosis tools. That process is still unfolding as we speak, but the NFL case gave the public a clear example of what happens when race becomes part of the equations. 2 players, 1 test, 1 injury, different outcomes. And a question that goes way beyond football. What happens when the numbers themselves are built to see people differently? Thanks for watching.